How's it going? So today I'm starting a series of Study with Me Azure as a video playlist. And I'm specifically creating this playlist for those who want to target an Azure certification exam, but they also look for a little boost of motivation. So this way, these series of videos will be beneficial to them, I hope. I'm targeting the AZ-305 exam myself, and since this is not the easiest exam of Azure, of course, I believe the most trusted material and content available on the internet is, of course, the mslearn website. So in this series, I'm going to go over the modules related to AZ-305 exam on the mslearn website in the self-paced learning path, and I will also use an AI text-to-speech natural reader to essentially read the page for me. And then in the middle, I might interrupt to add some comments and emphasize on the important points. So this way we can complete all these modules together faster than usual. So without further ado, let's get started. I hope you like it, and I hope you find it amusing as well.
Introduction 2 minutes.
So starting with the unit of introduction. And by the way, I will also do some drawings on the page to point out the important things. Here we go.
Introduction. Completed 100 XP. 2 minutes. The term governance describes the general process of establishing rules and policies. Governance ensures those rules and policies are enforced. A good governance strategy.
So here we're essentially talking about governance, and it mentions the rules and policies, and it is essentially trying to say that governance is a way to establish rules and policies.
A good governance strategy helps you maintain control over the applications and resources that you manage in the cloud. Maintaining control over your environment ensures that you stay compliant with industry standards, such as information security management.
So the word compliant, I think, is quite essential and important here, as policy and governance always goes with compliant hand in hand. And this compliance can be with multiple things, such as it is mentioned here, industry standards or corporate or organizational standards. So these are the things that we will achieve through a good governance on the resources that we have in the cloud.
Industry standards, such as information security management. Corporate or organizational standards, such as ensuring that network data is encrypted. Governance is most beneficial when you have multiple engineering teams working in Azure, multiple subscriptions to manage, regulatory requirements that must be enforced, standards that must be followed for all cloud resources.
So this part essentially tries to say that if you don't have a large organization, probably you won't benefit that much from the governance. However, if you have a very large organization that has multiple engineering teams or multiple subscriptions to manage, that is the case that you might be most definitely need a good governance strategy so that you can apply all the policies and stay compliant. There are also two other factors, such as regulatory requirements as well as standards that must be followed for all cloud resources. These would also be a good reason for establishing a good governance strategy.
Introduction. Meet Tailwind Traders. Tailwind Traders is a fictitious home improvement retailer. The company operates retail hardware stores across the globe and online. As you work through this lesson, suppose you're the CTO for Tailwind Traders. You're aware of the opportunities offered by Azure and also understand the need for strong governance. Without strong governance, the company might end up with an environment that's difficult to manage and costs that are hard to track and control. You're interested in understanding how Azure manages and enforces governance standards.
So I understood that this learning path, this module is essentially walking us through um, designing governance strategies for a fictitious organization called Tailwind, and it is assuming us as a CTO of the company. Um, and then it also mentions that we are, or at least we should be, aware of the opportunities offered by Azure. That's probably the first requirement. And then we would also be informed about the needs and requirements of the company. And once we match these two items together, then we can basically design a good governance strategy. And it is also telling that if we don't establish a good governance strategy for such an organization, then we will end up with an environment which is difficult to manage.
Learning objectives. In this module, you learn how to design for governance, design for management groups, design for Azure subscriptions, design for resource groups, design for Azure policy, design for resource tags, design for Azure landing zones. Skills measured. The content.
So, in the learning objectives, it is mentioning um, that we would need to get our hands dirty on multiple sections and features of Azure in order to establish a good governance strategy. And these would include the governance itself, the management groups, Azure subscriptions, resource groups, Azure policy, resource tags, as well as Azure landing zones. Now, out of these items, Azure landing zones is probably the least familiar one, the least famous one. The rest are, of course, primitive, features and parts of Azure. So I believe later in the module we will learn more about what each of them, what are the requirements for each of them, as well as specifically what are the requirements for Azure landing zones. So let's continue.
Skills measured. The content in this module helps you prepare for exam AZ-305, Designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solutions. The module concepts are covered in Design identity, governance, and monitoring solutions. Design a governance solution. Recommend a strategy for Azure policies and resource tags. Recommend a strategy for Azure blueprints. Recommend a strategy for Azure landing zones. Prerequisites. Conceptual knowledge of governance.
So it is essentially telling that designing a governance solution would be done through these three approaches or these three steps. Essentially, we should be able to recommend a strategy for either Azure policies, resource tags, Azure blueprints, and Azure landing zones. And this way, we can ensure a governance solution is implemented in place pretty well. And in the prerequisite section, of course, it is mentioning that we have to have a conceptual knowledge of governance policies, which is pretty simple. Pretty much everyone is aware of, like, what is a policy and what are standards, what does being compliant mean, so on and so forth. Then we have to also have some working experience with primitive features and sections of Azure, such as resource groups, how to put a resource into the resource group, how to move resources, how to apply or attach a policy to a resource group, for example, things like that. But anyway, I believe later in the module we would go over these subjects more in depth. Therefore, we will have a better understanding as well. So let's continue to the next unit. All right.
Design for governance. Completed 100 XP. 2 minutes. Governance provides mechanisms and processes to maintain control over your applications and resources in Azure. Governance involves determining your requirements, planning your initiatives, and setting strategic priorities.
So I think the important part here is that we're talking about priorities. Of course, governance always involves priorities, and it is essentially mentioning that we have to be able to set strategic priorities here. Um, and then maybe two main aspects of governance would be mechanisms and processes to maintain the control. So governance essentially provides um, the tools and the abilities to establish such control. Let's continue.
To effectively apply your governance strategies, you must first create a hierarchical structure for your organizational environment. This structure lets you apply governance strategies exactly where they're needed. The governance strategies we cover in this module are Azure Policy and Resource Tags.
Very important. It is mentioning that we have to first create a hierarchical structure for the organization. Otherwise, whatever policy and governance strategy you design would be applied globally on everything, which is 99% of the time not we ideally have or not we ideally want. So we essentially want to have granular control on maybe different departments, different sections, different types of applications within an organization. So having the hierarchy is quite crucial and important. And it also mentions that the governance strategies we cover in this module are Azure Policy and Resource Tags. So these would be the two building blocks for implementing the governance strategy in this module. Let's continue.
A typical Azure hierarchy has 4 levels: management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. We examine the details of these levels later in this module. Management groups help you manage access, policy, and compliance for multiple subscriptions. Subscriptions are logical containers that serve as units of management and scale. Subscriptions are also billing boundaries. Resource groups are logical containers into which Azure resources are deployed and managed. Resources are instances of services that you create. For example, virtual machines, storage, and SQL databases.
So the key point here is that the hierarchy can have 4 levels on Azure, so it can only be 4 level nested. Plus, there is a tenant root group on top, which is used whenever we want to apply something at a global level. The 4 nested levels consist of management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. Obviously, resources are the lowest level, and each resource has to be within a resource group. So the resource cannot be part of any resource group, or a resource cannot be dangling without a resource group. Then it is essentially explaining each of them one by one. So management groups can help you manage access policy and compliance for multiple subscriptions. So the word multiple subscription is important here. The subscription is a logical container that serves as a unit of management and scale. So very important. We have to know that it's just a logical separation. It is also the boundary for billing. As we know, in Azure, having a subscription is a must, is a requirement. Without that, you cannot work with Azure. Then resource groups are also just logical containers into which Azure resources are deployed and managed. So there is no physical separation between the resources, it's just a matter of visualizing it. And resources on the very lowest level contains, well, the services that we get from Azure, for instance, virtual machines, storage, SQL database, so on and so forth.
Note: the tenant root group contains all the management groups and subscriptions. This group allows global policies and Azure role assignments to be applied at the directory level.
All right, so the node is essentially what I explained earlier. It's about tenant root group that contains all the management groups in subscription. Therefore, it serves as the highest level, and it'll be used whenever we want to apply something at a global level, obviously. If I get this tool right
This
here.
group allows global
Yeah, so global policies have to be applied to the tenant root group. It can also be used for Azure role assignment. And then it mentions directory level, which essentially means global level. All right, this I believe this unit ends here, and I propose to stop here, and we'll continue the next units in the future videos. Thanks for sticking around. See you later.